The wind screamed through the cracked walls of the old transit tunnel, carrying the smell of dust, smoke, and burnt metal. Every few seconds, pieces of debris fell from the ceiling, echoing into the emptiness. Leora moved carefully through the wreckage, her boots crunching over shattered glass and twisted cables. The light from her small flashlight cut a thin path through the darkness, revealing broken signs, scattered helmets, and half-buried equipment. Her breathing was the only steady sound. The rest was chaos, pipes groaning, metal shifting, the whisper of wind that almost sounded like someone crying. She tried to ignore the chill that crawled down her spine. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the kind of silence that came after something terrible had happened. Hours earlier, she had been part of an evacuation team, helping both humans and alien settlers escape the storm that tore across the planet. But communication failed, shuttles crashed, and the tunnel system that was supposed to be a safe path had become a graveyard. Leora had returned alone, refusing to abandon anyone who might still be trapped below. The radio on her shoulder crackled with static, no voices, only the empty hum of a dying signal. She called out softly, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" Her voice echoed down the tunnel, bouncing off the walls before fading into silence. Then she heard it, a sound so small she almost thought it was her imagination. It wasn't a human cry. It was something softer, broken, like the whimper of a child or an animal. Her heart tightened. She turned off her radio to listen better. The wind died for a moment, leaving only that sound, faint and trembling, coming from deeper inside. Leora took a slow breath and moved toward it. Her flashlight flickered as she crouched to crawl through a fallen section of roof. The space beyond smelled of dust and cold metal. When she finally reached the other side, she stopped. A small pod lay broken open against the wall. Inside, curled up and shivering, were three small creatures she had never seen before. Soft fur, faintly glowing patterns along their backs, wide golden eyes blinking in fear. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Their tiny claws scratched weakly at the edge of the pod, too exhausted to move. For a long moment, Leora just stared. These weren't soldiers or survivors from her team. They were alien cubs left behind when the evacuation failed. She whispered softly, "Hey, it's okay. I won't hurt you." One of the cubs made a soft sound, like a weak purr, and tried to stand. The others pressed closer together, trembling. Leora lowered her flashlight so the light wouldn't blind them. She reached out a hand slowly, feeling their warmth even through her gloves. Outside, the wind howled again, stronger this time, shaking loose dust from above. But in that tiny space beneath the ruined tunnel, the cubs didn't flinch. They stared at her, frightened but trusting, as if something deep inside them knew she meant no harm. Leora felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know what she would do yet, or how she'd save them, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving them behind. The faint sound led Leora deeper into the tunnel, where the air felt colder and heavier. Dust floated like fog in the beam of her flashlight, and each step she took echoed off the walls. The noise came again, a soft, frightened whimper that made her heart beat faster. She crouched low, pushing aside a piece of fallen metal, and there she saw it. A shattered escape pod lying sideways against the tunnel wall. The pod's glass cover was cracked and covered in dirt, its lights flickering weakly. Leora knelt beside it, brushing away the grime, and gasped softly. Inside were three tiny creatures huddled together, trembling. Their fur glowed faintly. Soft streaks of blue and silver that shimmered like moonlight through fog. They looked frightened, weak and cold, their small bodies covered in dust and scratches. Leora's hand shook slightly as she reached toward the control panel, but it was dead. No power, no heat, nothing left. She carefully pulled open the rest of the cracked glass, and a sharp hiss escaped from inside, the last bit of air pressure releasing. The cubs whimpered, pressing closer to one another, their large eyes staring up at her with a strange mix of fear and hope. They were clearly alien, but in that moment, all Leora saw were small lives struggling to survive. She whispered softly, "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." Her voice was gentle, the kind she used when talking to scared children during evacuations. Outside, the storm roared louder, the sound of wind rushing through the broken tunnels like a living thing. Leora could feel the cold air creeping in, biting at her skin through her torn suit. She looked at the cubs again. Their little chests rose and fell quickly, and one of them let out a faint, broken cry. She knew they wouldn't survive long without warmth. She slowly took off her outer jacket, then hesitated. She didn't know if touching them would hurt them, or if they would react badly. But when she extended her hand, one of the cubs sniffed the air and gave a tiny, uncertain step forward. It touched her glove with its nose, then leaned its small head against her palm. The warmth of its body was faint but real. Leora felt something twist inside her, an ache, mixed with a strange tenderness. Carefully, she gathered the cub into her hands. The other two watched, tense at first, but when they saw their sibling safe in her hold, they began to relax slightly. Their glowing fur dimmed to a calm light, and the one in her arms made a soft purring sound that was almost like comfort. The tunnel around them rumbled again, dust raining from above. Leora looked at the broken pod one last time and made a quiet promise. She wouldn't leave them here. These weren't just creatures from another world. They were lives depending on her now. And as the storm howled outside, she realized something unexpected. In this dark, ruined place, she wasn't the only one who needed saving. The sound of the storm above was now joined by the crackle of her damaged radio. Static hissed through the speaker, followed by a distant voice, sharp, urgent, and full of authority. All personnel fall back to checkpoint. Repeat, fall back. Leave all non-human forms behind. The words hit Leora like a weight. She froze in the darkness, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The cubs stirred at the sudden noise, one letting out a tiny cry that echoed softly through the tunnel. Her training told her what she was supposed to do: follow orders, leave anything non-human, and save herself. But as she looked down at the three small creatures nestled near her boots, her heart rebelled against the command. They were alive, scared, breathing. And in that moment, no rule or voice from the radio could convince her that they didn't deserve a chance. She crouched down again, brushing dust off one of the cubs' faces. Their eyes reflected her flashlight's beam like tiny stars. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "I won't leave you." The words weren't a plan. They were a promise, one she hadn't even realized she'd made until it slipped from her lips. She glanced around the tunnel, searching for anything she could use. Her jacket was thick, though torn in places. It wasn't meant for carrying anything fragile, but it would have to do. Carefully, she spread it out on the ground, her movements slow so she wouldn't startle them. One by one, she lifted the cubs and tucked them inside, wrapping the fabric snugly around their small, glowing bodies. The smallest one whimpered, then nuzzled deeper into the warmth, its purring sound faint but steady. Leora took a deep breath. The storm was still raging outside, and the tunnels were unstable. Every few seconds, dust fell from the ceiling, and distant echoes warned that another collapse might come. She knew she had a long way to go before reaching the last human checkpoint, and the signal on her radio was fading fast. "All units, evacuate immediately," the voice repeated, distorted and fading into static. She turned the radio off. There was no turning back now. Adjusting the weight of the jacket in her arms, she realized her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the enormity of what she had just chosen. Disobeying orders during an emergency could mean exile, maybe even arrest, if command decided to enforce protocol. But what would be left of her humanity if she walked away from lives that trusted her? Slowly, she lifted the jacket to her shoulders, opening her hood and carefully tucking the cubs inside to keep them close to her body. Their warmth spread through her back, and the soft sound of their breathing filled the silence around her. Then, with one final look at the broken pod behind her, Leora began to walk. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, filled with darkness and danger. But each step she took echoed with quiet determination. She wasn't just carrying fragile creatures through a ruined world. She was carrying the choice that defined who she truly was. And as the wind howled through the cracks above, it almost sounded like the storm itself paused, listening to the human who refused to let compassion die. The tunnel moaned with the sound of moving air, as if the storm outside had found its way underground. Wind hissed through broken vents, carrying dust and fragments of concrete that stung Leora's face. Her boots sank into puddles left by leaking pipes, each step heavier than the last. She adjusted her hood carefully, feeling the small weight of the cubs nestled against her neck. They were so quiet now, their tiny bodies pressed close for warmth. Earlier, they had shivered and whimpered, frightened by every sound. But now, they seemed to trust the steady rhythm of her footsteps and the beating of her heart. The smallest one gave a soft, low purr that vibrated faintly against her skin. For a moment, she almost smiled. She moved slowly, watching for loose panels and fallen debris that could trap her. The emergency lights flickered along the walls, dim orange glows that barely pushed back the darkness. Every few meters, the ceiling groaned, dust falling like dry snow. Leora instinctively lowered her head to protect the cubs. Her arms ached, her lungs burned from the cold air, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The thought of leaving them behind felt impossible now, as if the act itself would break something inside her. These small, glowing creatures were depending on her completely, and that thought gave her strength she didn't know she still had. The tunnel curved sharply ahead, and she followed the faint arrows painted on the wall, remnants of old evacuation routes. Somewhere beyond this path, the last human checkpoint waited, maybe even safety. Her radio was silent now. She had turned it off hours ago to save power. In the thick silence, her breathing and the soft sounds of the cubs became her only company. The purring grew louder, steady, soothing. One cub poked its tiny paw out from her hood, brushing against her neck as if checking to see if she was still there. Leora chuckled quietly. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice rough but kind. "We'll make it." The ground trembled suddenly, a deep vibration that made her freeze. Somewhere above, a massive structure had given way. The sound rolled through the tunnel like distant thunder. Instinctively, she dropped to her knees, curling around the cubs to shield them. Dust clouded the air, her flashlight flickered, and then silence again. For a few seconds, the world felt frozen. When she finally opened her eyes, the cubs were still pressed close, unharmed. Relief washed over her like warmth spreading through cold limbs. When she stood again, she realized how quiet the tunnel had become. The wind still hissed through cracks, but softer now, almost gentle. The storm above could rage all it wanted, but here, under her hood, the cubs slept peacefully, their tiny breaths even and calm. It struck her as something profound, that in the middle of ruin, she could still carry life, still give safety, still create a pocket of peace. As she kept walking, her shadow stretched long against the flickering light, a lone figure carrying hope through the wreckage of a broken world. The tunnel ahead opened into a wider corridor where the air felt sharper, carrying the faint scent of rain and burning metal. Leora knew she was getting close to the surface, to the exit that led toward the last evacuation zone. Her steps quickened, though every muscle in her body begged her to stop. The cubs stirred faintly inside her hood, as if sensing her unease. Then, without warning, a harsh mechanical sound echoed down the passage. A red light blinked across the far wall, followed by the shrill tone of an alarm. Her heart dropped. The system had detected movement, but worse, it had picked up multiple life signs. A voice crackled through the speaker above. "Alert! Unauthorized biological signatures detected. Non-human presence confirmed. Deploying enforcement units." The words chilled her blood. Those enforcement units were the automated drones, machines built to protect evacuation routes by erasing anything alien that could be seen as a threat. They didn't think, didn't reason, and they definitely didn't understand the difference between danger and innocence. The cubs shifted nervously, one letting out a small cry. Leora pressed her hand over her hood gently, whispering, "Shh, stay quiet. Please." The sound of heavy metallic footsteps grew closer, echoing down the steel corridors like a rhythm of doom. Her pulse raced in her ears as she scanned the path ahead. The emergency lights flickered, throwing shadows across the walls. She spotted a broken pillar half buried under rubble and darted behind it, crouching low. Her breath came in short bursts. The cubs were trembling now, their soft bodies pressed close against her neck. She could feel their tiny hearts beating fast. Or maybe that was her own. Through a crack in the wall, she saw them. 2 drones gliding into view. Their sensor lights swept the corridor, red beams scanning every surface. Each time the light passed near her hiding spot, Leora held her breath, barely daring to move. One of the cubs made a small sound, a faint whimper that echoed slightly. Her stomach clenched in panic. She pressed her palm gently over the sound, murmuring under her breath, "It's okay. I won't let them take you." The words steadied her more than she expected. A sharp click came from the nearest drone as it turned its sensor in her direction. The beam of red light swept across the rubble, landing dangerously close to where she hid. Leora closed her eyes, waiting for the metallic voice that would seal their fate. But at that exact moment, a gust of wind burst through a vent above, scattering dust and debris across the hall. The red beam flickered, confused by the interference. Seizing the chance, Leora slipped out from behind the pillar and ran. Her boots pounded the floor, echoing like drum beats. The drones whirred behind her, alarm screaming. Sparks burst from the walls as they fired warning shots, but she didn't stop. She clutched the cubs closer to her chest, shielding them with her body. "Almost there," she gasped, her voice breaking from exhaustion. The exit light blinked faintly in the distance, a small, flickering promise of safety. And even as the machines closed in, her only thought was of the fragile lives she carried, and the vow she would not break no matter what it cost her. The corridor narrowed until it ended at a reinforced door, the last checkpoint before the surface. A faint blue light blinked above it, signaling the entry scanner. Leora stumbled forward, her breath ragged, the sound of the drones still echoing somewhere behind her. The cubs were silent now, hidden deep within her hood, as if they understood the danger. She reached the panel and pressed her hand to the scanner. A robotic voice replied instantly, cold and absolute. "Access denied. Alien life detected. Entry restricted." The words hit her like a blow. She stared at the scanner, disbelief mixing with panic. The drones were closing in, and this was her only way out. For a brief moment, her training took over. She checked the emergency bypass, the override codes, the hidden panel under the console, anything that could help. But the system was designed to protect the humans inside, not to make exceptions. She tried again, pressing harder this time. "Come on," she whispered, almost pleading. "It's me." The scanner pulsed red again, repeating the same sentence. "Alien life detected." Behind her, the tunnel lights flickered with the reflection of metal movement. The drones were closer now. Leora's pulse hammered in her ears. She looked down at her hands, shaking, and then at the small movement in her hood, the faint glow of the cub's fur against her neck. She couldn't leave them, not after everything they'd been through together. She had carried them through darkness, through fear, through a world falling apart. Dropping them now would mean betraying the only thing that still made her human. "No," she whispered almost to herself. "I won't do it." She knelt by the control panel, pulled open a small compartment, and took out a wire. Years of working as an engineer had taught her one thing. Every system could be broken if you knew where to look. Her fingers moved fast despite the trembling. Sparks flew as she stripped wires and twisted connectors. The screen blinked from red to white, flashing error codes. "Manual override engaged," the system warned. She ignored it and kept working. Smoke began to rise from the scanner, the smell of burning circuits filling the air. With one final twist, the console gave a loud pop, and the lights went black for a second. Then, with a grinding noise, the door began to slide open, not smoothly, but just enough for her to slip through. The effort triggered the drone's full alert. "Unauthorized entry detected," one blared, their metallic voices sharp and emotionless. Leora grabbed the edge of the door and forced it wider, her arms straining. When the first drone appeared at the end of the corridor, its sensor lights glowing red, she turned to face it. Her heart raced, but she didn't back away. Pulling her coat around the cubs, she stood tall between them and the machine. "You'll have to go through me," she said quietly, her voice shaking yet strong. The drones paused, scanning her. Sparks from the broken panel lit her face in flashes of orange and white. Behind her, the cubs moved faintly, safe within the folds of her coat. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, a single human standing against machines built for obedience and destruction. She wasn't thinking of orders anymore, or even survival. She was thinking only of the promise she'd made in the darkness, that she would protect them, no matter what. And in that instant, she wasn't just an engineer. She was a shield, defying a world that had forgotten the meaning of compassion. The heavy door slid open just enough for a figure to step through, a man in a dark uniform, his boots echoing against the metal floor. The bright insignia on his shoulder identified him immediately, Commander Wren, head of the evacuation unit. His expression was sharp, his voice filled the tunnel like thunder. "What in the world do you think you're doing, engineer?" he barked, pointing at the smoldering panel. "You burned out your ID chip, breached protocol, and disobeyed a direct evacuation order. You could have compromised the entire checkpoint." His words struck with force, but Leora didn't move. She stood still, her coat pulled close, her back slightly turned to protect what she carried. The cubs stirred faintly inside her hood, as if sensing the tension. Commander Wren stepped closer, fury still etched on his face. "Open your coat," he ordered. "Now!" His tone was harsh, the kind meant to command instant obedience. Leora hesitated, her eyes steady but tired. Slowly, she loosened the front of her coat and pulled it aside just enough for him to see. The commander's words caught in his throat. 3 small alien cubs, glowing softly in shades of pale gold and silver, blinked up at him. They were curled together, peaceful and calm despite the chaos around them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the low hum of damaged machinery and the faint purring that came from her hood. Wren's anger seemed to falter, replaced by disbelief. They trust you?" he said quietly, as if unsure he believed what he was seeing. One of the cubs lifted its small head, blinking sleepily before nestling closer to Leora's neck. The gesture was so gentle, so natural, that it silenced every doubt in the air. The commander stared at her, his voice softer now. "You carried them through the tunnels? Past the drones? You risked your life for them?" Leora looked down at the cubs, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she met his eyes and said in a calm, steady voice, "They trusted me before I even earned it. They trusted humanity, even when we don't deserve it." Her words hung heavy in the air. For years, humanity's survival had come at the cost of compassion. The rules were meant to protect, but in doing so, they had built walls around hearts. Now here stood one woman who had broken every order to keep life safe, not for reward or recognition, but because it was right. Wren's gaze shifted between her and the cubs, his stern features softening. He had seen soldiers disobey for selfish reasons, but never for something like this. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of distant wind moving through the vents. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders lowering slightly. "You realize what this means?" he asked quietly. Leora nodded. "Yes," she said. "It means we still have a chance, if we choose to be better than the rules that made us forget who we are." The commander didn't reply. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then reached up to his earpiece and switched off the base signal. "No one needs to know what happened here," he said at last. "Get them inside." And for the first time in what felt like forever, humanity didn't look like a word on a report. It looked like a heartbeat shared between a soldier, an engineer, and 3 small creatures who had dared to trust. Commander Wren stood for a long moment, his weapon still in his hand, the metal glinting faintly under the emergency lights. The cubs were looking up at him, their glowing eyes calm and curious. Slowly, he lowered the weapon until it hung at his side. The anger and tension that had filled the room moments ago began to fade. He turned toward Leora, who still stood protectively around the cubs, and gave a small nod. "Let's get them inside," he said quietly. It wasn't an order this time, it was an act of understanding. Together, they stepped through the checkpoint door and entered the dimly lit command center. The room went silent the moment they appeared. Soldiers and technicians stared in disbelief as Leora walked in, her coat still wrapped around the small, glowing creatures. Wren spoke first, his voice steady but carrying weight. "Call the science team," he said. "Immediately." No one dared question him. Within minutes, a group of researchers gathered around, their equipment humming softly. Leora placed the cubs gently on a padded table, her hands trembling slightly. The cubs blinked at the bright lights but didn't cry or move away. Instead, they leaned toward her hand, as if sensing that she was still their safety. The lead scientist leaned closer, scanning the readings on her device. Then she froze, staring at the screen as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. This can't be right, she whispered. Rain frowned. What is it? The scientist turned the screen toward him, her voice trembling. Their DNA signature matches the Thalan species, the same race that vanished after the collapse. Everyone believed they were extinct. A stunned silence filled the room. The Thalan had once been allies during the early colonization years, known for their intelligence and peaceful nature. If these cubs were truly their offspring, it meant that a part of that lost civilization had survived, and that humanity had just been given a second chance to make things right. Ren looked at Leora, then back at the cubs who were now curled together again, their faint glow lighting up the cold metal surface of the table. You didn't just save 3 lives, he said slowly. You might have saved our future. The realization spread through the room like a quiet wave. The same woman they had nearly punished for breaking protocol had just protected something far greater than anyone had imagined. One of the cubs let out a small sound, and Leora reached out to calm it, her fingers brushing against its soft fur. The scientist smiled faintly. They seem to recognize you, she said. Leora shook her head gently. They don't just recognize me, she replied. They trust us. Humanity. Her words carried a meaning everyone in the room felt. For the first time in years, there was no talk of sides or species, only the shared silence of people realizing what compassion could build. Rain stepped forward, looking at his team. From this moment, he said firmly, no harm will come to them. We protect them as one of our own. The soldiers nodded, and the scientists moved carefully to prepare a shelter for the cubs. Warm blankets, oxygen control, and a gentle light setting. As Leora watched them settle, she felt a strange calm. The storm outside still howled, but in this small corner of the world, something had changed. The woman once accused of breaking rules had just helped rewrite them, and for the first time, humanity remembered what it truly meant to care. The days that followed felt almost unreal. The storm that had once torn across the colony finally passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness. The air was clean, the sky soft and blue, the kind of calm that made people forget how close they had come to disaster. Inside the small shelter yard, laughter and soft chirps filled the air. The 3 cubs, now stronger and more playful, chased one another around the grass, their faint glow flickering like tiny lanterns. Leora sat on a bench nearby, her jacket folded neatly beside her, a rare smile on her face. She watched as one of the cubs tried to climb a low wall, stumbled, and then tumbled back into her lap. She chuckled softly and brushed the dust from its fur. You're getting better, she said quietly. The cub looked up at her with bright, trusting eyes and let out a tiny, happy sound before running back to join the others. For the first time in a long while, Leora felt peace. Not the kind that came from safety, but the kind that came from doing the right thing. Around her, the shelter had changed. Where there was once suspicion and fear, now there was warmth. Soldiers who had once kept their distance now brought small toys and food for the cubs. The scientists, too, worked carefully, not as cold researchers, but as caretakers. Even Commander Ren, usually quiet and stern, stopped by every morning to check on the cubs before his briefings. The sight of them had become a reminder that not all victories came from strength. Some came from kindness. Word of what happened spread quickly across the colonies. People began whispering about the human who had defied direct orders to protect life, not for power, not for glory, but because it was right. Some called her reckless. Others called her brave, but most simply called her human. The story traveled faster than any broadcast, passed through messages, camps, and even off-world relays. On distant outposts, soldiers repeated her name as a story of hope during long, dark nights. Reporters came to the shelter to see for themselves. They found not a hero standing tall, but a woman sitting quietly among glowing cubs, her eyes soft and thoughtful. When asked why she did it, she simply said, "Because someone had to care first." Those words became quoted across every channel, short, simple, but powerful. In the following days, small changes began happening everywhere. Rescue teams were ordered to scan for all life signs, not just human ones. Colonies began forming new committees focused on coexistence, inspired by what Leora had done. It wasn't a revolution of force. It was a quiet shift in hearts. That evening, as the twin moons rose above the colony, the cubs huddled beside Leora, their soft purring blending with the gentle hum of the night wind. She looked up at the stars, thinking of the day she found them in the dust and chaos. Now under the same stars, they were safe. And maybe, just maybe, the universe had begun to heal. Not because of rules or weapons, but because one human chose compassion over command. Years had passed since that storm, and the world that once trembled in chaos now stood calm and rebuilt. The tunnels, once filled with dust, wind, and fear, had become a place of memory. At the entrance of one such tunnel stood a simple memorial, a smooth stone wall engraved with gentle words. Even the storm slept, because compassion spoke louder than fear. Travelers often stopped there, tracing the letters with their fingers, feeling the quiet power behind them. Few who passed by truly knew the full story, but everyone could sense the warmth it carried. The story of one human who had chosen kindness when everyone else chose rules. Every year, visitors came, humans, travelers, and even members of distant alien colonies. Among them were three figures who stood out, tall, graceful beings with fur that shimmered faintly under the light. The cubs had grown, no longer fragile or frightened, but strong leaders of their kind. They came silently, without escort or ceremony, bringing small, glowing flowers from their homeworld. They placed them at the base of the memorial and stood there in silence, their eyes soft with memory. They didn't remember the sounds of war or the orders shouted over radios. They didn't remember the cold fear of the tunnel or the machines that chased them. What stayed in their hearts was the warmth of a human's arms, the gentle heartbeat that had calmed them when the storm howled above. To them, that moment had become more than survival. It had become a lesson. Compassion, they learned, was a power no weapon could replace. As the cubs stood there, humans from nearby settlements watched quietly. Some bowed their heads, others simply smiled. For many, the story of Leora, the engineer who saved life instead of following protocol, had become part of their children's lessons. In classrooms across colonies, teachers told the tale of the woman who defied fear to protect what was innocent. She didn't just save them, the story went, she reminded us what it means to be human. The memorial itself had become a symbol of peace between species. Once, humans and aliens had looked at each other with distrust. Now they worked side by side, building ships and settlements together. The alliance that grew from that single act of compassion had reshaped the galaxy's future. And at the heart of it all was one memory: a human walking through a broken tunnel, holding frightened cubs in her arms, whispering softly, "It's okay. I've got you." As night fell, the grown cubs lingered a while longer, their glowing eyes reflecting the soft light of the stars. A cool wind brushed through the tunnel entrance, carrying a faint, almost familiar hum, like a distant lullaby. For a moment, it felt as if the universe itself paused to remember her. The storm that once raged across the galaxy now rested in peace, because one heart, long ago, had been brave enough to care.